Why can someone seem emotionally fragile, needy, clingy, and desperate for reassurance, while at the very same time coming across as controlling, demanding, entitled, or even aggressive? What if vulnerable narcissism is not just about insecurity, neediness, or emotional fragility, but about a much deeper conflict around dependency, aggression, and one's sense of self? In this episode, we're going to explore the hidden psychological conflict underneath vulnerable narcissism and why dependency, shame, longing, and emotional control are often far more connected than you may realize. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. It's been a while since I've spoken about vulnerable narcissism here on the podcast. If you find these next two episodes helpful and you want to do a deeper dive into this topic, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to episodes 57 through 60, and I think I had even a couple more after episode 60, where I explored the emotional world of vulnerable narcissism and specifically the idea of, and I quote, containment. In this two-part series, I want to take a deeper dive into the inner workings of vulnerable narcissism. Today, in part one, we will begin by describing how vulnerable narcissism presents itself, and then we'll move into what it actually looks like and what's happening psychologically underneath that presentation. We will begin to outline the split psychological world that organizes this structure, which I'll say more about in a moment, and we will also start to clarify how what can look like aggression is often only one part of a much more complex internal conflict around dependency itself. In part two, and I hope you'll stay tuned for that, we'll dig into a prototypical example that will help us see how this dynamic actually plays out in actual relationships. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get right into it. Let's start with a basic overview of the presentation of vulnerable narcissism. In other words, how does it tend to present itself? For those of you who have been following the show, this will serve as a quick review, and for those of you who are new, a brief introduction. Many people experiencing vulnerable narcissism do not appear grandiose in the classic sense, although of course the grandiosity is there. Instead, they may present as chronically anxious, dependent, depressive, clingy, emotionally fragile, deeply sensitive to rejection, or constantly in need of reassurance and caretaking. They may seem helpless while simultaneously placing enormous emotional pressure on the people around them. From a psychodynamic perspective, these patterns often reflect a mode of what we might call, and I quote, narcissistic repair. In other words, they derive a sense of worth, stability, and feeling special through the emotional responses they evoke in others, specifically through insecurity, neediness, or distress. Why? Because that elicits a caregiving, attentive, or reassuring response. And as many of you know, this is often what we refer to as narcissistic supplies. However, what makes this dynamic so complicated is that the dependency itself can become emotionally consuming, both for the person suffering and for those trying to help or relate to them. Let's take this one step further, because the question that naturally emerges here is how can someone seem so needy, fragile, or desperate for reassurance, while at the very same time appear controlling, entitled, demanding, or even emotionally aggressive? In other words, what exactly is happening psychologically? This dynamic does not only happen between parents and adult children, something I focused on quite a bit again in those earlier episodes. It can emerge in marriages, romantic relationships, friendships, and even in therapy itself. It can involve someone who unconsciously expects somebody else, maybe you, to stabilize them emotionally, carry the anxiety, absorb the uncertainty, make decisions, reassure them constantly, or even help hold them together, hold together their sense of self-worth. And from a psychodynamic perspective, this is where the picture becomes much more complicated, because what often gets overlooked is that underneath the dependency, there's a split psychological world organized around both an idealized, grandiose sense of expectation, and on the other side of this split is a deeply devalued sense of self. Even though someone with this presentation may idealize you or depend on you, insist that they need you, or express enormous appreciation for your support, there's often another side operating at the very same time. You might help them financially. You might offer guidance, encouragement, emotional availability, or repeated reassurance. But the moment you encourage movement toward greater independence, such as getting a job, tolerating frustration, delaying gratification, confronting reality, accepting limits, or functioning more autonomously, to name a few, it can suddenly feel as though your efforts no longer matter at all. And many clinicians, that's therapists, partners, and family members experience this dynamic as deeply, and I quote, aggressive, confusing, or emotionally draining, especially if you keep trying to help, you keep trying to offer advice. But psychodynamically, the aggression is only one part of the story. Beneath the aggression is often an intense conflict around dependency. So let me say that again, because this is one of the main points I want to drive home and then build on in the later episode in the second part of this. The aggression is only one part of the story. Beneath it is often an intense conflict around dependency. On one side is the grandiose self, again, the main structure of the narcissistic organization. The grandiose sense of self is organized around specialness, entitlement, superiority, and the need to avoid shame or limitation at all cost. But split off from that is a deeply devalued aspect of the self. That's the needy, frightened, ashamed, emotionally hungry, and longing to be fully cared for side of the self. And what often gets missed is that these demands for care are not only controlling or manipulative, which in part, of course, they could be. Again, you frequently hear me say this in the different clusters of narcissism. They are also expressions of longing for something emotionally total and unbroken, longing for total acceptance, longing for an idealized caregiver. That's someone who will always be there. That's what you're looking for, someone who's always present, attuned. Longing for a relationship where dependency can finally exist without humiliation, criticism, rejection, or abandonment. And this is where the emotional paradox of vulnerable narcissism really begins to emerge. You may desperately need closeness, reassurance, and emotional caretaking, while simultaneously you resent the very dependency that you cannot tolerate within yourself. So the dependency gets defended against, disowned, controlled, or transformed into entitlement, withdrawal, helplessness, or even extreme vulnerability. When all of this is explored, I often hear things like this. I shouldn't have to ask. He should already understand me. If he really loved me, he would just know. Or, I don't need him anyway. That's the corollary. That's the other side of it. But underneath those defenses is often a terrifying expectation. If I truly depend on someone, eventually I'll be disappointed, emotionally let down, humiliated, controlled, or even abandoned. Now, I want to highlight this, is that oftentimes this is really believed, that you really believe that this person in your life is disappointing, right? Or that they always let you down. But what I'm trying to get at here is that this is an inner expectation. This is something that gets carried around from relationship to relationship. So, we are beginning to map out the basic presentation of vulnerable narcissism, and more importantly, the underlying internal structure that organizes it, particularly the split between the idealized and devalued self. and the way dependency gets defended against and expressed indirectly through emotional pressure, sometimes withdrawal, and relational intensity, that the other person should always be there for you. Relational intensity, right? Because when they're not there, you may begin to push and push to get what you think they should be giving you. And sometimes there's even a belief that they should be there for you and that you shouldn't even have to ask. They should just know what you need, because isn't that what a good partner does? Shouldn't they understand you? So therefore, you don't have to ask. But remember, in not asking, you never have to expose a need. And that brings us back to the conflict around dependency. If you don't ask, you never have to depend on somebody. In part 2, we're going to take all of this and bring it into a more concrete relational example so we can actually see how this vulnerable internal world gets enacted in real relationships, how it shows up between two people, and what it feels like on both sides when one person begins to rely on the other, not just emotionally, but psychologically. And again, this is where things get intense. This reliance can become so intense that the other person is expected to and gradually begins functioning not simply as a partner, but as a regulator of your emotional stability, thinking, sense of certainty, and even your capacity to hold yourself together internally. So yes, they take up that role in part due to the pressure that's placed on them. Okay, everyone, much more to say about this, but thanks so much for joining me today. I hope this helped you begin to make some sense of these vulnerable narcissistic dynamics, and I hope it made it just a little bit more understandable. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll take this even further into that concrete relational example and explore what these dynamics actually feel like between two people in a relationship. Until next time, bye for now.